Please be aware that I do not represent any company. I'm not endorsed by or affiliated with any automotive manufacturer or car dealership. All opinions expressed in this video are my own, and all trademarks, logos, and brand names are the property of their respective owners.
Hey guys, Victor G here. Today we're going to be replacing a front wheel bearing on a 4x4 Toyota Tundra. You can see it's got a significant amount of play in there, and it's howling like crazy. So we're gonna do the replacement today. It's a bit of a pain, but I'm gonna show you how it's done. First thing we're gonna do is take off the wheel. I also have a wheel spacer on it, so that will be the next thing to come off. You may or may not have one of those. Next step is to loosen these two bolts here, holding the brake caliper to the knuckle. And then what I like to do is hang it out of the way with a couple of jumbo zip ties, or you can use like a bungee cord or some sort of an arrangement like that. With the caliper secured out of the way, you can now take off the rotor. Now if it's stuck and doesn't want to come off, you can jam some M8 by 125 bolts in there. That's gonna press it off the hub, but mine is loose and comes off easily. Gotta take off this cap here covering the nut for the axle. Sometimes it's quite difficult to get it off. I usually use a little chisel like this or a flat blade screwdriver and just tap it in from the side until it pops off. We can finish it off with a pry bar like that. Now we gotta take out this cotter pin here and a little castellated nut cover that's holding the nut from coming loose. So you can use the side cutters here to manipulate this cotter pin and then pull it out the bottom like so, and then this little guy comes off. And then you need, I think it's a 39 mil. I've got a 1 5/8 imperial socket, and it's gonna bang this nut off. And then you want to make sure the axle actually slides here, and it does. If it doesn't, you can hit it with like a plastic mallet or take a round punch and hit it with a metal hammer in the middle. But don't be banging on it because you're gonna damage the threads if you hit it on the side with a metal hammer. Next thing we gotta do is take off this connector here. You can take this cover off of it and then push on it to slide it off, or you can be sneaky and just get a little flat blade screwdriver in here and pop it up like this, and it comes off. And then we're gonna loosen this M5 hex and get this speed sensor out of here. So oftentimes this sensor is going to be seized in there. There's an O-ring and sometimes water gets inside, and it's very hard to get out. You cannot be turning it like this because the sensor is flat on the inside and it sits against the magnetic tone ring. So you can't be twisting it, but you can wiggle it a little bit, and then sometimes it's a real pain in the butt, but you can get a flat blade screwdriver under it and keep wiggling it until you twist it back out. So we're gonna do that. And there it goes. So I've had this thing out a bunch of times, so it's covered in grease, and the reason for it is they just get seized. That O-ring gets a bunch of dirt on it, and then it's almost impossible to get it out. But this isn't my first wheel bearing on this truck. After this, we can go ahead and unbolt the bearing from the knuckle. It's just 4 17mm bolts holding them on. You can't get in there with a wrench. You need with a ratchet. You need a wrench, and I have a handy little extender to kind of apply a little more torque to it. So once these 4 bolts are loosened, I'll show you a trick of how to get this hub and bearing assembly off of the knuckle, because usually it'll be seized on inside there and it's extremely difficult to get it off. So there's a little trick to it. So what you can do is take a ball bearing, or you don't really need to put one in, you can just use the head of the ball, but I like putting a ball bearing in there because it facilitates less friction. And then you actually use this bolt against the back of the stud on the hub to press the assembly right off. So as you are turning the bolt, you can see there is a gap forming right there, and the hub and bearing assembly is getting pressed out of the knuckle. So it's kind of a little trick that you can do, and that's going to help you get it off, because otherwise you have to use a slide hammer and a pry bar. And so now that it's loosened off at the top, you can take the ball bearing out, put it here on the bottom, and you can use this stud to do the same thing in essence. And set up this bolt with a bearing on the back of the stud, and keep cranking on this guy and go around in a circle if needed, and then eventually see it's coming off on the bottom there. The gap is growing. So spend some time, do it properly. Don't crank it out all the way one side and then the other side's gonna get cocked over and not come out. But see right there, we have a gap, so it's coming apart. So keep doing this until the hub and bearing assembly is completely loose. So once all the bolts are loose and you press the hub and bearing off as far as you can just wiggle it off, and then it comes off right here, and the dust shield is going to come off with it as well. So when doing a front bearing, there are 3 seals that need to be replaced, and the most important one is right here. And unfortunately, most shops don't actually replace this seal, because replacing requires getting this knuckle unbolted and out of the way and getting the axle shaft out. A lot of times what they'll do is they'll just change the dust shield around the front of the bearing and the O-ring in the back here, if you're lucky, and they leave this one alone. And that's where I find most of the repeat bearing failures come from. So we're gonna do a good job, and we're actually gonna replace this one, even though it's a bit of a hassle. So to do that, we're gonna undo these two bolts right here from the bottom, at the bottom of the ball joint setup here to the steering knuckle, and then we're gonna get this guy out of the way. So before we undo these bolts here that hold the knuckle to the ball joint, you wanna compress the strut, or not compress it, but put all the load on the lower control arm, because otherwise it will be really difficult to connect this back up again. So now we got it loaded up and we can take those 2 bolts out. Once the axle is out of the way, you can put the bolts back in, just so that everything's kind of held together properly. And then we can punch the seal out of here. So this is the inner seal that most shops unfortunately don't bother replacing. Next, you want to wipe all the grime and all the crap out from inside there. It's full of water and grease. And then clean up the surface, and also clean the inside area here. That's where the new seal is going to be pressed in, so we want to clean that really good. So the next thing I did is hang up the axle by a bungee cord here, so it just kind of happily dangles and doesn't fall out when I pop it out. And the reason is I'm gonna take the axle out because my axle seal there was leaking a little bit. So while I'm doing this wheel bearing, I'm gonna replace the axle seal as well. So to replace this axle seal, you get a hammer and a big punch and pretty much start hitting it from the back really hard on the back of it right there, and then it's gonna come out. Catch the gear oil leaking out of there. Few more taps. And out she goes. Take the bungee off and slide it out. There's our axle. So one thing we want to do is clean up this surface of it right here. That's where the seal that we're replacing in that knuckle, that's where that seal rides on. So this needs to be nice and clean, otherwise it's not going to seal anything. Now we're going to pull this seal out, the axle seal out here. So in essence you need some sort of a pry bar or similar tool and jam it in behind, but don't go too far in, because then you're going to scratch the inner bore here that the seal sits in. So just don't go too deep, and then just pry it out of there. And there we go. There's the seal. Then clean the inside of this bore with just don't go with a grinder in there. Just wipe it off nicely and make sure it's nice and smooth so the new seal sits in there nicely. Take the new seal, lube the inside of it with gear oil so that it doesn't burn up on the shaft when it spins. You always want them to be lubricated, and then arrange it in place, and then use something to drive it in. I have an old wheel bearing here that I'm gonna use that sits on it nicely, so we're gonna start with that. Make sure not to go too deep. That feels seated evenly. So these are the 3 seals that you need to be replacing every time you do a wheel bearing, and oftentimes some of them or none of them don't get replaced. So this is the O-ring that goes between the front face of the steering knuckle and the back of the bearing. Then this is the seal that goes on the front of the bearing, and then this is the one that goes in the back of the knuckle. So that's the one we're gonna install right now while we have the axle out. So what works pretty well is putting the seal in here, kind of getting it in place, and then using a flat little piece of wood tap it in with a hammer. And that's it. So what we're going to do is install this axle. Now I cleaned this mating surface nicely. That's where that seal that we're just going to install is going to ride on it. So if you leave that all rusty and crusty, obviously it's not going to seal anything. And just wiped everything down here. There is another 4th seal right here. It's kind of crappy on here. It's more of a dust shield that prevents large chunks from getting in there. So we're not going to be replacing that today. I don't think it's available as a separate assembly. And then on this end there's a little trick to it. So you have the snap ring right here, and there is one way that is very easy to install it and one way is really hard. So if you look at the end of this axle, if the snap ring is hanging down like this, you can imagine as you're trying to get it into the bore, it's gonna be really hard to get past this. Now the trick is to have it flip upside down so that the opening in the snap ring faces downwards. Now when you are jamming it into the bore, it just compresses these ends here and makes it really easy to insert it in there. What I do is take some thick grease, axle grease, and jam it in here, and what that's going to do is going to prevent the snap ring from turning out of position. And then you take a marker and you mark the center line of it somewhere here. So now you know that that's where the center line of this opening is. And when you go to install the axle, you make sure that this mark is pointing down towards the ground. So we're gonna grab our axle shaft, make sure that that mark we made is pointing down, and we're gonna get it in there. Be careful not to hit the seal with it as you're going in, because otherwise you're gonna have a little problem. And then you pretty much grab it by the end here and give it a little push. Sometimes it's a little harder. There we go. This one is really stubborn. Gonna get a rubber mallet of persuasion and get it in there. Really doesn't want to go in, eh? Oh yeah. Whew. That was a pain, but it's in there now. So one thing I like to do is just put a bunch of water resistant axle grease inside there. That way, if and when any water makes its way there, which pretty much is bound to happen when you're off-roading like crazy and fording rivers and mud bogging and everything, it's unavoidable. But this way, hopefully this protects the bearing a little bit longer and we don't end up replacing it every couple of years. Okay, so we're gonna move on to the fun part of pressing this hub out of this bearing. So some shops will make you buy a new hub every time you do a bearing, because I've had it happen to me when my truck was under warranty. The Toyota dealer told me, oh, the hub is seized in a bearing and we can't press it out and we want you to, you know, buy a new one. So at that point I didn't want to argue with them, so I just got one through my supplier and had them replace it. But I have never been unable to press this out. I mean, you just need the right tools to do it. So some shops just don't have a press big enough to do it, and then they make you buy a new one. But with the right tools, it's no problem. So let's get to it. So all we need to do is set up it's called a bearing spreader. So it's two halves like this connected by a threaded rod, and what we gotta do is set this up so that I can support it in a press like so. So I can press the actual hub out of this bearing. It's gonna look something like this. Hooks it up right onto those 4 ears that the bolts go through. Okay, so here's our setup. First we have a big piece of 12-inch pipe, and this is there so that the hub fits into it and we can actually press it out. And then our bearing spreader sits in there like that. And then we need some sort of a metal pipe or something that's gonna fit inside and needs to be smaller in diameter than the inside of the bearing. Now we make sure everything is nice and flat and centered on here. And we can take our press and start pumping. Double check that I didn't make any mistakes. Oh yeah, she likes to make a loud noise. Ooh. The bolts are falling out. Okay, so there it goes. So there's the bearing. Well, the one side of it got pressed out. There's the other side, full of water and rust. As you can see, it's a very rusty brownish color. It's not supposed to look like that. And this thing was howling like crazy, so doesn't even look that damaged, but it's rusty as hell. So there you go. So this is just the first part of the job. Here's our hub, and it still has the one race of the bearing that's still pressed onto it, and the bearing here is still stuck there. So this bearing piece, you can just pry it off with a pry bar, but then the race is gonna have to be pressed off. So we're gonna use the same bearing spreader and set it up to get the rest of this off of here. Okay, so what I did was set up this bearing splitter in a way that it just grabs the bottom of the bearing race, and sometimes you can press it off this way, sometimes you actually have to cut the race and split it with a chisel. We'll see if we get lucky on this one and we can just get it off like this. The bolts for the bearing, they were just laying there. I'm just setting this up a little bit lower so I can actually get my press adapter in there. Alright, here we go. Let's try this. Okay, pump away. Well, that's nice. It's actually coming out. A lot of times it won't, and I have to cut it, so I wanted to show you how that's done, but I guess not today. Today, we'll have it the easy way. Alright. Well, that wasn't bad at all. So that's the other half of the bearing, and there's the race. So if this race gets stuck on the hub and you can't press it off, you can just cut it right across with a cut-off wheel, and then hit it with a big hammer and a chisel, and it cracks it, and then it just slides right off. So we didn't have to do that. So now we're gonna start cleaning and reassembling this thing. So I'll tell you a little secret that you may or may not know. Toyota doesn't actually manufacture majority of their parts. They're supplied by, OEM level suppliers, which are third-party companies which Toyota buys the parts from. So our front wheel bearings are actually manufactured by Koyo, which is a very good quality bearing company. So the truth of the matter is, whether you buy a Toyota wheel bearing for $300 some or your Koyo wheel bearing, it's exactly the same wheel bearing that comes out of the same factory. And the difference is, it's either packaged in this little blue box and it costs $100, or it's packaged in a red and white box that says Toyota all over it, and it, you know, the price triples all of a sudden. So we have a really nice, I don't know if you can see, says USA right there on it. So a nice American bearing, Koyo right here, and it is good to go. Okay, so before we press our hub into this bearing, it's critical to make sure to put this outer seal onto it, because once the hub is pressed on, there's no way to get this on. So usually I just use a small punch and go around this metal rim here and just tap it on. Sometimes it's a pain in the butt, sometimes it works pretty easy, so we're gonna try and see how it goes. Well, it started. Once you hear that satisfying metal on metal type of sound, that means it's seated. So just go around, give it a couple of whacks, and it's good to go. And then make sure you clean this surface on the hub right here, because that's where the seal that we just installed rides on. So if you leave it all crusty and rusty, it ain't gonna seal anything. So now we're gonna go back to our jig in a tool room with a press and press all of this together. Okay, so the couple ways to set this up: you can have the hub on the bottom, and then you can stick the bearing onto it like this and press it on. The one small issue with that is your bolts are going to be sitting like this, so it's really easy for them to fall out. And these bolts, you got to remember to put them into the bearing before you press everything together, because once the hub and the bearing are pressed together, you don't have enough space to get these bolts in. And I have seen, I think once somebody did that before, and then you end up buying a new bearing because you can't press it out without damaging it. So we're gonna press it in the opposite way. So we're gonna have the bearing laying down, and we're gonna press the hub in. Also, if you're doing it this way, make sure not to just press on it like this, because all you're gonna do is you're gonna press these studs right out of the hub face, and then make sure to support it in the middle somewhere there, so that the studs aren't bearing the pressure. So in some cases, like on an RX or something, or Camry or a Highlander, this is a fine way to do it. We're gonna do it the other way. So what's really important is when you're pressing this hub in, because you'll be pressing on the inner race here, you have to support the inner race on this side. You can't support this outer race, because otherwise this inner race will just get pressed out and this bearing will be destroyed. So back in my apprentice days, I've done that once on like an old Nissan Sentra that was my mother-in-law's, and I learned that 15 years ago, so I haven't made that mistake again. But pretty much make sure to support this inner race right here while we're doing it. So I'm gonna set it up and then I'll show you how it's done. And also there's a plastic sleeve in here that holds the two halves together. Don't pull it out, leave it in there. If you pull it out, this bearing will just fall apart. There's gonna be nothing holding it together. So you need to make sure there's space underneath for when you're pressing this out, that the sleeve has somewhere to go, because the hub is going to be pushing it out as it goes. So let me set this up and we'll go from there. Okay, so this is our setup here. So this is just a couple of old Tundra bearing races. As you can see, this isn't the first bearing I've replaced on one of these trucks. And I saved them just for this occasion because they're the perfect size to let, this is one of the old plastic sleeves that holds them together, so it fits in there quite nicely. And we're gonna set up this bearing and make sure it's perfectly centered on top of this race so that that sleeve, as it gets pressed down, it has somewhere to go. So just make sure it's very nice and even side to side and lined up straight all around, okay? Then we're gonna get our hub in there. And this guy goes in here. And then on top of that, we're gonna use some sort of a spacer just to pick up the travel from that jack. And now we just wanna nicely move all of this right under our press, like so. Take up the clearance. Make sure it's centered. Okay, just double check everything because we only get one shot at this. So, see, one thing I notice is my bolts, they're not in. So, don't make this mistake or you'll be ordering another wheel bearing, and it's after hours right now, so all the parts stores are closed. Make sure the bolts are pointing the right way, so if the hub's from this side, then the bolts need to be pointing down because that will be towards the steering knuckle. Make sure our seal here is installed. Everything's nice and clean. You don't need to lube this, at least I've never been told to. It will just press right in. It's got 20 tons of force pushing on it, so it'll be happy. And then, yeah, make sure the bearing is still centered. It didn't shift from us moving things around, and start pressing away happily. One last check. Yeah, everything looks good, so let's go. The press is maxed out, so we'll just need to add another little spacer or something in here. I've got a few laying around. Get this thing in here. It's a little bit longer. All right, keep going. Should be wearing goggles while you're doing this. I'm gonna put my shield on here so if something blows up, I don't get hurt. Still moving. Okay, so there's a lot of resistance right now, so it's bottomed out. You can give it one last little push and it doesn't want to move anywhere, so that's it. Release the tension, take everything apart, and here is your nice new hub and bearing assembly. We're gonna go start putting this back together. Okay, so this O-ring here is the last of the 3 seals that we need to replace, so grease it up a little bit, and then that goes on the back of the bearing right here, just like that, and that prevents moisture from getting in between the bearing and the steering knuckle. And then in essence, this is all ready to come together, so don't forget to put the dust shield in between the bearing and the steering knuckle. I've already cleaned it up before, so it's ready to come on. And this is an updated design, so helps reduce brake vibration. I think at some point they've replaced it to the one with these bigger holes cut in it. So I think I've bought these a while ago, the last time I did it. So here we go, we're gonna start reassembling it. Okay, well, in essence, as most repair manuals say, the assemble in the reverse of the disassembly process. So I'm not gonna bore you with it, I'll just quickly show you what I'm gonna do. So first I'll bolt the bearing onto the steering knuckle. I'll put the brake backing plate on there, then put the bolts in, tighten those up. Then we're gonna stick the drive shaft into the back of the bearing. We're gonna connect these bottom ball joint bolts to the knuckle, and then we're just gonna put the brake rotor and wheel speed sensor, yada yada. Everything that we took out is pretty much just going back in. So simple as that. So I'll do a quick little time lapse and then I'll show you the finished product, guys. Well, there you go. Wheel bearing replacement and axle seal replacement on a Toyota Tundra. Trusty old Big Blue. I've had her since 2008 and she's still chooching along, getting me around to Victor Island and off-roading, camping and whatnot. Actually used to be supercharged too, but after blowing up so many engines on this beast, I've decided I'd rather stick to just one supercharged Tundra. Alright guys, cheers, see you next time. Brakes on one of my trucks.